January 10th, 1943. A thin layer of fog clung to a small airfield outside Paris as a Luftwaffe courier plane prepared for departure. Inside its cockpit sat two German officers, both carrying sealed leather pouches marked Geheime Kommandosake, top secret command material. Their orders were routine: deliver the documents to headquarters in Tunisia, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army was struggling to hold North Africa. What they carried, however, was not routine. The pouches contained the complete operational plan for Germany's upcoming defense strategy in the Mediterranean: airfield locations, troop strengths, and codes. It was information so sensitive that its loss could unravel the Axis position across the entire theater. The aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf-108 liaison plane, lifted off in the late morning, banking south toward the French coast. The pilots had flown this route before, connecting occupied France with Italy and North Africa. But the winter weather was worsening, and navigation over the Mediterranean had grown treacherous. Clouds obscured the sea, winds shifted violently, and radio signals weakened. Somewhere over southern France, disoriented and low on fuel, the pilot made a fateful decision: to turn east toward what he believed was the Italian coast. Moments later, the plane crossed an invisible line, the border between Axis-controlled territory and Vichy France. Below lay neutral soil, but one patrolled closely by Allied agents. Minutes after touchdown at a small airfield near Béziers, local authorities, nominally independent but quietly aligned with the Germans, approached to investigate. The officers, confident in their credentials, spoke openly, identifying themselves as Luftwaffe couriers. They asked for refueling, planning to continue their flight to Tunis. But within hours, the situation shifted. Word reached the Vichy regional commander that a German courier plane had landed unannounced, carrying sealed military pouches. Protocol required immediate report to Berlin, but the region's intelligence chief was already in discreet contact with American OSS operatives in Algiers. By nightfall, Allied intelligence had been alerted that something extraordinary had just fallen into their reach. In the confusion of divided loyalties, the pouches were quietly copied before being returned to the Germans, who were allowed to depart. They never realized the documents had been photographed. Within 48 hours, microfilm of the material crossed the Mediterranean to Allied headquarters in North Africa. What the Americans received was beyond anything they had hoped for: complete, up-to-date plans of Axis defenses in Tunisia and Sicily, including encrypted orders for upcoming supply convoys. The delivery had been unintentional, but its consequences would shape the next year of the war. The intelligence gained from that landing would guide Allied operations in the Mediterranean, help secure victory in North Africa, and lay the groundwork for the invasion of Italy. A single navigational error by two officers, acting in full confidence of their duty, had shifted the balance of strategy. In the coded messages that followed between London, Washington, and Algiers, one phrase recurred: accidental delivery confirmed. Material authentic. The Allies now held the enemy's blueprint, and the enemy had no idea it was gone. When the microfilm arrived at Allied headquarters in Algiers, the reaction was immediate and subdued. Intelligence officers gathered in a dimly lit room, unrolling the photographs with gloved hands. Before them lay a complete map of Axis strength across the Mediterranean: supply routes, troop dispositions, and detailed schedules of air transport between Italy and Tunisia. It was the kind of intelligence that usually required months of espionage, decrypted intercepts, and lives lost in gathering fragments. Now it was all here, perfectly clear, handed over by accident. The documents were authenticated within hours. Signatures matched known German officers, and the formatting was consistent with Luftwaffe field orders. The reports included instructions from the German High Command outlining emergency reinforcement plans for North Africa, coordination procedures with the Italian Navy, and specific dates for expected fuel deliveries. It was the entire command structure of the Axis Southern Front exposed. The implications were enormous. For weeks, Allied strategists had debated whether Germany intended to defend Tunisia heavily or withdraw its forces to Europe. The intelligence settled the question. Berlin planned to fight for every inch, using Tunisia as a defensive fortress to delay any Allied invasion of Italy. That revelation transformed the Allied timetable. Commanders now understood that if they could intercept the convoys supplying Rommel's divisions, the Axis foothold in Africa would collapse. American and British intelligence sections coordinated instantly. Copies of the microfilm were flown to London and Washington under diplomatic cover, each set handled as if it were nuclear material. The combined chiefs of staff ordered secrecy so strict that even some senior commanders were told only the conclusions, not the source. Officially, the new information was credited to reliable signals intelligence. In practice, the data changed everything. Allied submarines and aircraft began targeting Axis convoys with uncanny precision, striking tankers and transports along routes the Germans believed secure. Fuel shortages grounded much of the Luftwaffe's North African air fleet within weeks. Rommel's request for resupply went unanswered or delayed. The convoys he awaited never arrived. The collapse of logistical support that followed was not coincidence. It was the unseen hand of the intelligence his own officers had delivered. Meanwhile, in Berlin, confusion spread through the staff sections of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Allied attacks had become too accurate, too deliberate. Reports reached the Luftwaffe's operations branch, questioning whether radio codes had been compromised. New encryption keys were ordered, though no one suspected the true cause. The officers who had carried the documents were unaware of the disaster their landing had caused. In Algiers, analysts worked day and night, cross-referencing the captured plans with decrypted Enigma intercepts and reconnaissance reports. The consistency was astonishing. The documents provided not only targets but context, how German planners thought, how they moved reinforcements, how they expected the Allies to act. For the first time, the Allies could think inside the enemy's logic rather than react to it. This single intelligence windfall began to bridge the gap between Allied material superiority and German tactical skill. For months, the Allies had fought uphill against an opponent who anticipated their every move. Now that advantage had reversed. The report summarizing the find was marked simply, "Source reliable. Consequences strategic." It was an understatement. Within 3 months, the North African campaign would end in Allied victory, and it would begin with the accident of 2 German officers and their misplaced pouches. By February 1943, the intelligence gathered from the captured documents had begun to influence every level of Allied planning. The microfilm, reproduced and distributed only to a handful of senior officers, became the foundation for a new operational framework in North Africa. The information wasn't just tactical, it revealed the entire rhythm of the German command system. The Allies could now anticipate Axis movements before they began. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers, operations planners adjusted convoy interdictions and ground offensives using the data. The documents included precise maps of Luftwaffe, forward airfields, fuel depots, and supply dumps scattered across Tunisia. Each target was methodically attacked in early February. Bombers struck not at random, but with perfect accuracy, destroying fuel caches, grounded aircraft, and transport vehicles exactly where German records said they would be. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched, began to suffocate. The accuracy of the Allied attacks startled German commanders. Reports from the front described convoys ambushed far from any known patrol routes, depots bombed within hours of their establishment, and newly arrived equipment destroyed before it could be distributed. Field officers accused their subordinates of carelessness, believing someone had leaked information. Counterintelligence searches began within the Afrika Korps, but no trace of espionage was found. The real spy had been the courier's compass. At the strategic level, the intelligence reshaped Allied thinking about the Mediterranean. Before the capture, the future of operations after North Africa had been uncertain. Some in Washington argued for a direct invasion of France, others for Italy. Now, with the German defensive plans for the region exposed, Italy became the logical next step. The documents revealed weaknesses in Axis coastal defense along Sicily and southern Italy, gaps in radar coverage, understrength garrisons, and logistical vulnerabilities. Planners realized they could strike at the soft underbelly of Europe, an idea that would soon become official Allied policy. In London, the Joint Intelligence Committee compared the stolen data to intercepted Enigma messages in aerial photography. The match was perfect. Every name, every code, every position aligned. Analysts confirmed that the Germans were unaware their system had been compromised. This gave the Allies a priceless window. They could act on the information freely, while the enemy remained oblivious. By March, Allied command summaries contained phrases that would have been impossible only months earlier. Axis reinforcement schedule known. Fuel shortage critical. Enemy reaction predictable. The tone had shifted from defensive caution to quiet confidence. In war, such transitions are rare and fragile. But in early 1943, the Allies sensed the tide turning, and they knew precisely why. The OSS and MI6 worked together to conceal the true source of the intelligence. Disinformation channels were created, feeding Berlin fabricated stories of spies in Tunis and intercepted radio transmissions. These diversions drew attention away from the real cause. Two officers' unintended delivery of Germany's Southern Defense Blueprint. At the same time, the Americans refined their approach to intelligence fusion. The Tunis material, as it was called, became an early model for centralized analysis, combining human, signal, and photographic intelligence into unified assessments. It demonstrated that even in modern warfare, a single stroke of luck could unlock entire chains of consequence if processed correctly. By the time the Allies began planning Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the captured documents were still shaping decisions behind closed doors. Few would ever know their origin. The phrase "from reliable source" would appear repeatedly in orders and briefings, a quiet acknowledgement of the accident that changed the Mediterranean War. By April 1943, the German High Command still had no idea that its most guarded strategic plans were circulating through Allied war rooms. The losses in North Africa continued to mount, and the Luftwaffe's supply operations were collapsing under relentless Allied precision. Every convoy sunk, every depot destroyed, followed routes and schedules known in advance to Allied planners. What the Germans perceived as uncanny accuracy was, in truth, the direct consequence of their own documents, copied, analyzed, and weaponized. At Allied headquarters, the intelligence became a living instrument. Analysts built detailed maps connecting every airfield, supply corridor, and command node mentioned in the files. Red lines marked where convoys would appear. Blue lines traced expected retreat routes. The data revealed not only where the enemy moved, but how he thought, how orders were delayed by bureaucracy, how fuel priorities shifted between panzer divisions and air units, and how predictable German logistics had become under stress. In May, when the final battles of the North African campaign unfolded around Tunis and Bizerte, the Allies struck with uncanny precision. Air raids crippled remaining Axis airfields, isolating ground forces from support. The timing of those attacks was no coincidence. They corresponded exactly to resupply attempts scheduled in the stolen plans. German air crews, starved of fuel, were forced to abandon aircraft intact as Allied troops advanced. The fall of Tunisia marked the end of the Axis presence in Africa. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. In Allied post-campaign assessments, the influence of intelligence was described in restrained terms. Advance information of operational value contributed to success. In truth, it had decided the outcome. But even as the fighting in Africa ended, the information from the Tunis Papers, as they were now informally called, continued to shape strategy. Among the captured documents had been detailed outlines of the German defense network in southern Europe, specifically Sicily, Calabria, and the western coast of Italy. These sections were now dissected by planners in London and Washington. The maps showed gun emplacements, air defense grids, and coastal artillery arcs. Many were incomplete or outdated, but they revealed something invaluable, where the Germans expected the next Allied attack and how they planned to counter it. That knowledge became the seed of deception. In mid-1943, Allied planners conceived a series of operations designed to exploit those assumptions. Using the stolen material, they crafted false patterns, reinforcing German expectations that Greece or Sardinia would be the next target. The groundwork for deception operations, such as Mincemeat and Barclay, was laid directly atop insights drawn from the Tunis material. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch issued reports claiming Allied strategy in the Mediterranean had grown increasingly predictable. They believed that Allied success stemmed from intercepted German messages, never realizing that the breach had occurred months earlier through human error. The same systemic confidence that had once propelled the German war machine now blinded it. For Allied intelligence officers, the success reinforced a crucial lesson. Information alone changed nothing. It had to be understood, trusted, and acted upon. The rapid coordination between British, American, and Free French commands demonstrated a maturity that had been missing early in the war. The accidental gift, as one officer later called it, had forced them to grow into a single analytical organism. By the end of April, the pouches originally carried from Paris had done more to shape the Mediterranean campaign than any single battle. They had provided foresight where once there had been guesswork. And as the Allies prepared to carry the war to Europe's mainland, they would do so with a detailed map of the enemy's thought process, one the enemy still believed secure. By May 1943, as the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered en masse, Allied intelligence officers quietly celebrated a different kind of victory. The Tunis material had not only predicted the outcome of the campaign, it had created it. Every German loss on land and sea could be traced in part to a folder of documents that had crossed the Mediterranean disguised as diplomatic mail. And yet the officers who had delivered them by accident were still unaware of their mistake. In Berlin, German staff officers drafted reports to explain the disaster in Africa. They blamed the Italians for poor coordination, the weather for lost convoys, and Allied radar for the sudden accuracy of air attacks. No one considered the possibility that the Allies possessed exact copies of their orders. The two Luftwaffe couriers were reassigned quietly, their navigational error noted but forgotten amid the chaos of defeat. In their minds, they had completed their mission months earlier without consequence. Meanwhile, in Allied headquarters from Cairo to London, the documents continued to shape decisions that reached far beyond North Africa. Analysts pored over the remaining pages, maps of Sicily's coastline, estimates of Italian troop morale, and memoranda describing German expectations for future Allied landings. Among them were detailed contingency plans for Axis reinforcement by sea, listing ports, timing, and escort schedules. Those schedules became the foundation for Operation Husky's naval interdiction phase. Every ship that left Naples or Taranto after June sailed into traps laid with intelligence taken from those pages. The success bred a new kind of discipline within Allied intelligence. The experience of exploiting the Tunis material became a template for structured analysis. It proved that when intelligence, logistics, and operations worked in unison, even the enemy's strengths could become predictable. In Washington, reports on the North African precedent circulated through the Joint Intelligence Staff, influencing how the Allies would handle all future captured materials, from aircraft to codebooks. For planners in London, the documents offered something more subtle but equally vital: insight into German thought. The phrasing, tone, and the structure of the memos revealed a system obsessed with hierarchy and procedure. Orders moved slowly, authorization required signatures in triplicate, and even emergency measures demanded written approval. To Allied analysts, this confirmed a growing hypothesis that Germany's command system, though precise, was rigid. It could not adapt quickly when surprised. The Tunis find was not only a set of plans, it was an X-ray of the German mind. In preparation for the invasion of Sicily, Allied deception units drew directly on those psychological weaknesses. The very way the Germans had written their orders, methodical, cautious, reliant on precedent, told the Allies exactly how to mislead them. Operation Mincemeat, launched weeks later, played into that logic perfectly. When false documents suggesting an invasion of Greece were planted on a corpse and discovered by the Axis, Berlin accepted them as genuine, because their own procedures dictated that all intelligence of that format must be authentic. The connection between the Tunis material and the later deception campaigns was never made public. Official history spoke of Mincemeat as an independent success, but in the archives, analysts noted the continuity. Both depended on understanding the German system from within, an understanding born from the files that two officers had carried out of Paris and into Allied hands. As the summer of 1943 approached, the Mediterranean War had entered a new phase. The Allies were no longer improvising, they were orchestrating. The flow of information, once uncertain and fragmented, had become systematic. And at the heart of that transformation lay an accident no one had planned, no one could repeat, and no one in Berlin had yet discovered. By June 1943, the transformation sparked by the Tunis material had spread through every layer of Allied command. What began as a fortunate accident had evolved into a model for modern intelligence coordination. Across London, Washington, and Algiers, new joint analysis centers were established to merge intercepted signals, aerial reconnaissance, and captured documents into a single operational picture. For the first time, the Allies could see the war as a system, one that could be mapped, measured, and exploited. The stolen German papers became more than information, they became a proof of concept. They showed that victory could be engineered through comprehension rather than attrition. Allied strategists studying the documents noted how the German army moved predictably according to doctrine, its logistics precise but inflexible. From this came a new style of warfare, calculated disruption. Instead of meeting the enemy's strength head-on, the Allies began targeting the gaps that their procedures created. The planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, reflected this philosophy perfectly. The German defense network in southern Europe, outlined in the Tunis papers, had revealed not only troop locations but command timing, how long orders took to move from Berlin to the field. With that knowledge, Allied deception teams crafted false radio traffic and diplomatic leaks to reach the German high command at precisely the speed their bureaucracy expected. When real Allied landings began on July 9th, German divisions were still waiting for confirmation of attacks in Greece and Sardinia, exactly as the stolen documents had predicted they would. In the air, the consequences were just as dramatic. The Luftwaffe's defensive deployments had been charted in the Tunis files down to individual airfields. As the Allies prepared to strike Sicily, bomber routes were adjusted to exploit those gaps. Radar stations were destroyed before they could relay warnings. Interceptor bases were hit in coordinated waves, leaving invasion convoys virtually untouched. The efficiency was startling. Months of fighting compressed into days of decisive strikes. In Berlin, disbelief replaced analysis. The pattern of Allied foresight seemed impossible. Reports from Sicily described enemy knowledge of our movements inconsistent with known espionage. Investigations into leaks began once again, focusing on local collaborators, Italian officers, even cipher clerks. But the true breach, the unintentional delivery of classified material months earlier, remained buried under bureaucracy. The German command simply could not imagine that their disaster had begun with two of their own. Meanwhile, in Allied intelligence circles, the Tunis material was treated with near reverence. Copies were stored in separate safes under constant guard. Analysts referred to it not by name, but by code, Source 17. It became a benchmark for evaluating all other intelligence. If new information contradicted Source 17, it was double-checked. If it confirmed it, it was trusted instantly. The captured files had become a silent authority behind the decisions of generals and politicians alike. When the invasion of Sicily succeeded beyond expectation, the results were studied carefully. The fall of the island in just over a month marked the beginning of Italy's collapse and the end of German control in the Mediterranean. Allied leaders credited air superiority, coordination, and morale, but inside intelligence briefings, the verdict was simpler. The enemy had been read from within. The Germans, unaware of the depth of the compromise, continued to use similar operational formats for months afterward. Every new directive, every updated plan reflected the same structure revealed in the Tunis documents, allowing Allied analysts to anticipate responses even before they were intercepted. By the time Allied troops entered Messina in August 1943, the war in the south had fundamentally changed. The Germans were still fighting with strength, but not with secrecy. Their plans no longer guided events. They predicted their defeats. And behind every successful operation in that theater, the quiet fingerprints of two misplaced pouches remained. By late summer 1943, the echoes of the Tunis material reached far beyond the Mediterranean. The lessons drawn from it were now shaping Allied operations across the entire European theater. What had begun as an isolated stroke of luck had evolved into a doctrine, a belief that knowledge could substitute for numbers, that understanding the structure of the enemy's mind was as powerful as defeating his army in the field. In London, British and American analysts met daily in a new coordination cell known informally as the Fusion Room. Its core mission reflected the lesson of the Tunis find. No single source of intelligence could stand alone. Every message intercepted by Ultra, every reconnaissance photo, every captured document had to be cross-checked and merged. The aim was to recreate the enemy's world as precisely as possible. The Tunis experience had proven that when that picture was complete, victory followed naturally. Reports from Sicily confirmed the method's success. German units had fought bravely but without coherence, their movements delayed by command confusion and deception. The Allies, operating with synchronized intelligence, seemed to anticipate every reaction. When Italy surrendered in early September, the domino effect was immediate. German plans for counteraction, partly based on directives identical in structure to the ones captured months earlier, were predicted and countered before they could stabilize the front. In Washington, the American Joint Chiefs reviewed classified summaries of the Tunis intelligence and its operational impact. The documents were described as a perfect intersection of accident and analysis. The OSS used the case as a teaching tool for new field officers, illustrating how chance favored those prepared to recognize it. The moral was clear. Accidents alone changed nothing. Only organization could turn them into strategy. On the ground in Italy, the same principles guided the advance. Using what they had learned from the German planning system, Allied staff officers began projecting enemy reactions with mathematical precision. When a bridgehead was established, they could predict within hours which unit would counterattack, from which direction, and with what strength. The German war machine, once admired for its efficiency, now operated in a pattern that the Allies could chart in advance. In Berlin, internal investigations continued without resolution. Reports circulated through the Abwehr and Luftwaffe intelligence branches, each blaming the other for leaks that could not be traced. Cipher changes, tightened security, and counterintelligence campaigns yielded nothing. The possibility that the Allies had seen their planning documents was never seriously entertained. The idea seemed absurd, a level of coincidence incompatible with military logic. Yet coincidence had long since turned into consequence. The original pouches, forgotten in bureaucratic archives, had done their work months earlier. Every strategic step the Allies now took in southern Europe, from Naples to Salerno, was built on assumptions first validated by those stolen pages. Even as new intelligence sources emerged, analysts continued to measure them against the Tunis benchmark. It had become the invisible standard of accuracy. By the end of 1943, the war in Europe had reached a turning point. The Wehrmacht was still formidable, but its aura of invincibility had vanished. The Allies were no longer chasing the German timetable. They were writing it. In internal Allied memoranda, this shift was often described not as a victory of arms, but of comprehension. They had learned to see through the enemy's structure, to think as he thought, to predict his actions, to dismantle his rhythm. Few in the field would ever know that this transformation began with a courier's navigational mistake on a foggy January morning. But in intelligence circles, the legacy of that era was clear. It had demonstrated that in modern war, the greatest weapon was not the tank or the bomber. It was the document misplaced in the right hands. By early 1944, the impact of the Tunis material had become invisible but permanent. Woven into the fabric of Allied intelligence practice, the system that had been improvised in response to a single accident was now institutional. Every intercepted transmission, every aerial photograph, every captured diary was processed through the same framework of synthesis the Tunis documents had inspired. It was no longer a matter of collecting secrets. It was about understanding the pattern of an entire enemy machine. In the Mediterranean, Allied forces advancing up the Italian peninsula continued to use knowledge derived from the original find. The structure of German command, its timing and its habits, had changed little. When the Allies launched landings at Anzio in January 1944, planners built their schedule around the same logistical patterns the Tunis files had revealed a year earlier. German reinforcements, they predicted, would take 48 hours to mobilize and 72 to arrive. They were correct to the hour. At Allied headquarters in Naples, analysts no longer referred to the captured documents by name. but their methods echoed through every staff meeting. Intelligence summaries contained diagrams of command flow, modeled on German procedure. Officers had learned that understanding the tempo of an opponent's bureaucracy could be as decisive as knowing his troop strength. The war had become a contest of structure, and the Allies now dominated that field absolutely. Across the Channel, preparations for the coming invasion of France drew on the same logic. The Allied deception plan, later known as Operation Fortitude, depended on predicting how the German command would process and believe false information. Those predictions came from years of studying the thought patterns first exposed in the Tunis papers. How orders moved upward for validation, how conflicting reports were reconciled, and how senior staff preferred to trust written confirmation over intuition. The same system that had doomed the German response in Sicily would now paralyze them in Normandy. In Berlin, exhaustion and disbelief spread through the upper ranks. Each new Allied success was explained as coincidence or espionage. Field marshals complained of unnatural timing, of enemy precision beyond probability. Internal memos urged faster communications, greater autonomy in field commands, fewer delays in decision-making. But these measures came too late. The structure of the German war machine, centralized, cautious, dependent on documentation, had become its own trap. The same strengths that had powered its early victories now bound it in rigidity. For Allied intelligence officers, this realization became doctrine. Reports circulated between London and Washington outlining how future wars must be fought not only with weapons, but with comprehension of systems. The Tunis material had taught them that every army, no matter how disciplined, left a pattern of behavior that could be mapped, predicted, and exploited. To modern strategists, that was more valuable than any number of divisions. By spring 1944, few who handled those original pages remained in active service. The microfilm copies were sealed in archives under classified headings, their origin known to only a handful of senior officials. But the effect endured everywhere. In the way Allied command predicted enemy movements, in the coordination between air and ground, in the speed of decision-making. What began as a courier's blunder had matured into a philosophy of warfare. And while the officers who once carried the documents continued their careers in Germany unaware of their legacy, the armies they served were slowly losing their freedom to maneuver. Each decision they made, each movement they ordered, unfolded according to a rhythm that their enemies now understood completely. When the Allied fleets assembled in the Channel that June, they did so guided by a doctrine born in the Mediterranean. A belief that the surest path to victory was not surprise by force, but surprise by understanding. By the summer of 1944, the pattern that had first emerged from the Tunis material had reached its final evolution. The Allies no longer fought the German military as an unpredictable enemy. They fought it as a system whose responses they could forecast with precision. Each decision on the Western Front reflected lessons first learned from those misplaced documents a year and a half earlier. The war had become a contest of tempo, and the Allies now controlled it completely. During the Normandy campaign, intelligence summaries displayed the same analytical fingerprints that had defined the Tunis breakthrough. Charts outlined expected German reaction times, command hierarchies, and reinforcement schedules, all derived from the structural knowledge gained from the Luftwaffe courier's error. Allied staff officers predicted how long it would take for orders to reach Corps headquarters, when counterattacks would form, and when confusion would set in. Those predictions match reality with eerie consistency. The same pattern applied in the air war. Allied bomber commands, armed with knowledge of German logistics networks, targeted fuel depots and repair facilities in precisely the right sequence to paralyze the Luftwaffe. The reports captured in 1943 had revealed how aircraft maintenance and refueling were coordinated through a small number of regional hubs. By 1944, those hubs no longer existed. The German Air Force could still fight, but only in fragments, its coordination broken by attacks planned on information the enemy had never realized was compromised. In Berlin, the consequences of that ignorance deepened. Each German setback triggered new security directives, each one slower and more restrictive than the last. Orders required multiple authorizations, movement reports had to be filed in triplicate, and officers hesitated to act without written instruction. The bureaucracy tightened under pressure until initiative itself became impossible. It was the same structure the Tunis papers had exposed, now ossified by fear. At Allied headquarters, intelligence officers studying these responses recognized the paradox. They had not only learned the enemy's system, they had taught him to depend on it even more. The German command had trapped itself in the very processes that once made it efficient. Every time the Allies exploited a weakness, Berlin responded by adding new layers of procedure, ensuring the next defeat would arrive even faster. By August 1944, the collapse in France mirrored the earlier fall of Tunisia. German forces retreated from Normandy in disarray, leaving behind entire corps encircled at Falaise. In internal Allied evaluations, the success was attributed to predictive operational intelligence, a phrase born from the Tunis incident, but now central to modern warfare. It meant fighting not just with power, but with foresight. In Washington and London, planners were already applying the same principles to the war in the Pacific. The lessons of the Tunis find were universal. Every complex system revealed itself through its documentation, and once that structure was understood, its future could be predicted. What had begun as a localized intelligence event had grown into a revolution in military thinking. Within Germany, however, the story of the lost documents was buried in silence. No records surfaced in post-war interrogations. No officer came forward to admit the mistake. The couriers who had landed in Vichy territory in 1943 were never publicly identified. Their routine flight, logged as completed, vanished into the paperwork of a crumbling Reich. But the effects of their journey endured in every Allied victory that followed. From Sicily to Normandy, from the Falaise pocket to the gates of Paris. It was the invisible thread connecting each success, the understanding that wars could be won by deciphering not only what the enemy did, but how he thought. By autumn, as Allied forces crossed into Belgium, the intelligence staff quietly archived the final analysis of the Tunis material. Its value was considered expended, its lessons fully absorbed. Yet the officers who sealed those files knew that its impact would outlast the war itself. They had witnessed the moment when luck became system and system became doctrine. By the spring of 1945, the story of the Tunis material had come full circle. The war in Europe was ending, and the German Reich, whose military precision had once seemed unstoppable, was collapsing under its own weight. The very system that had driven its early victories now ensured its downfall, predictable, slow, and trapped in procedures that Allied intelligence had understood for 2 years. The seed of that understanding had been planted by accident on a foggy January morning when 2 Luftwaffe officers had simply lost their way. In the ruins of Berlin, fragments of once secret files littered abandoned offices. Staff clerks burned what they could, unaware that much of it had already been read and exploited long before. The Allies no longer needed spies to know Germany's strategy. The entire structure, the timing of its orders, the rhythm of its logistics, the habits of its commanders, had been studied, dissected, and mastered. The Tunis material had given them the blueprint, and everything afterward had been confirmation. At Allied headquarters, as victory became certain, a quiet effort began to consolidate wartime intelligence archives. Among the thousands of reports stored in London, Washington, and Algiers, one slim file remained classified far above the rest. It contained the microfilm photographs of the 2 pouches captured in Vichy, France, their edges worn from repeated handling. A note inside read simply, Source 17, retained for historical study. Few who opened it understood that within those pages lay one of the most consequential accidents in military history. In post-war debriefings, intelligence officers reflected on how that single event had changed their approach to warfare. It had taught them that understanding a system, its structure, timing, and assumptions, was more powerful than any secret weapon. The lessons from the Tunis find would shape the creation of post-war intelligence agencies, where the fusion of signals, human reports, and analysis became the norm. The methods born from that microfilm would evolve into the framework of modern intelligence. The idea that war could be anticipated, not just fought. The 2 officers whose error had set it all in motion vanished into history. Their names appeared only in forgotten flight logs, their mission recorded as completed without incident. They would never know that their flight had redirected the course of the war, shortening it by months and saving tens of thousands of lives. Their mistake had exposed the architecture of the German war machine and handed the Allies the one advantage that no army could defend against: foreknowledge. For the men who had analyzed those documents in Algiers, London, and Washington, the significance of the find remained clear long after the shooting stopped. It had not been luck alone. It had been the ability to recognize luck for what it was: a door briefly opened into the enemy's inner world. They had stepped through it and never looked back. When the file marked Source 17 was finally declassified decades later, historians were astonished by its simplicity. No spies, no elaborate theft, no heroic capture, just a single flight off course, two sealed pouches, and a chain of decisions that turned an accident into strategy. The microfilm revealed a truth that had defined the entire Allied intelligence revolution. Sometimes the smallest human errors expose the greatest systems. In the end, the Tunis material was not just a collection of papers. It was the moment the Allies learned that knowledge itself could be a weapon sharper than any blade or bomb. From that lesson came an intelligence philosophy that would guide every major power for generations. Wars are won not only by courage or strength, but by understanding the structure of the enemy's mind. And it all began with a wrong turn over France. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.